This is News Bulletin for February 1st, 2014. I'm Jakob Musick. Seka, thank you so much for being on The Word again.
Not a problem. I always love chatting with you, Jacob.
Did the thought of entering the pageant excite you?
I thought it was dumb, and I didn't think I had any grace or poise whatsoever, but apparently I was wrong.
Fox News, the Bible, and tantric sex.
No, we don't talk about the novella. Do you know that there is one copy of that novella on Amazon right now? One copy, and it's going for like $4,000. I'm dead serious. You should look it up.
What is it considered, a lost classic?
No, classic is not the right word for it. Maybe a classic failure. And it wasn't really my fault, Jake. It was yours.
What?
And
what? Are you saying I made a mistake? That's unthinkable, right?
At the end of the first interview, you were like, okay, if you like this book, and this book, then you would like the Duchess Quest, and you wanted me to like name those books. Well, you edited out the part where I said, hey, can I say movies instead of books? And so, and then it just cut to me naming all these movies, and I look like an idiot.
So, as we know from the beginning of the creation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or what we call North Korea colloquially, it has always seen the West and South Korea as a threat. Just as much as North Korea was a product of the Soviet forces occupying the territory, the South Korean state was a product of the United States from the very beginning.
Israel is headed by, it's predicated on a ethnocentric, religio-centric ideology. Israel is the rogue nation. Like you said, it has hundreds of nuclear weapons, up to 400. It did acquire this from the West.
For more on this, let's go live to Orlando, Florida, from where Jakob Musick, host of Voice of the Revolution Radio, joins us on the Skype. Master Musick, thank you so much for being with us. So, a few hours ago, Trump said he believed the words of his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin about having no role in the U.S. presidential elections. Today, he is telling us that he believes the words of the American intelligence. What is going on?
I mean, there's a couple of possibilities here. Either he really does not know what he's talking about. He believes that the statements he's saying are compatible when they're not. Or he has very little or no regard for the truth, so he says whatever is expedient in the situation, or he doesn't care. And to be honest, just to take one sentence in some of his comments today, if I may quote, I'm surprised there's any conflict on this. What I said there is that I believe he believes that, and that's very important for somebody to believe. I believe that he feels that he and Russia did not meddle in the election. That sounds like somebody who has no idea what they're talking about. And to be honest, he's the U.S. president. He has no excuse for that. That's the kind of statement that could have came from our president 2 presidencies ago, George W. Bush, who, as we know, he relied very much on his team of advisors when it came to foreign policy to make up for his lack of knowledge. So in Donald Trump, we see characteristics of both 2 presidencies. We see, similar to George W. Bush, we see the fact that he really is not that knowledgeable when it comes to foreign policy and seems to not know what he's talking about often. And then the characteristic of our last president, Barack Obama, kind of saying words and sentences and messages that he didn't really mean. So in truth, it's, in my assessment, Donald Trump combines the worst 2 elements of these last 2 presidencies.
And this is despite the fact that he has often boasted about his intelligence, saying that he's a very intelligent person on numerous occasions that have been recorded. So what does this say, and what does this actually mean for Trump on the international scene if his words cannot be taken seriously?
Yeah, well, a lot of these leaders, I mean, behind closed doors, these leaders must be laughing at themselves when they look at quotes like this, and they do have to receive him. And some, like China, have received him in a very elegantly orchestrated ceremonies and clearly have enjoyed hosting him for whatever reason. But I think a lot of world leaders don't take him seriously. And so, of course, that weakens the U.S.'s position as the superpower of the world, and definitely makes a segment of the liberal elite, and even maybe some of the Republican elite, very worried that this is our figurehead, because they need an efficient, at least they need a figurehead that makes sense when he's speaking.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, we have Jakob Musick, a host of Voice of the Revolution Radio, also Richard Millett, who's a journalist and political commentator.
This is not illegal, despite the fact that it takes several millions, perhaps even billions of hard currency away from those nations, makes it untaxable, and it allows the rich, the bourgeoisie, the elites of the world to keep a lot of their money without having to contribute to the public trough. It may, different people may find it immoral or moral, perfectly justified or greedy. However, what is being revealed is the extent to which the global elite is using legal means for paying the least tax in their home countries. Successive governments of these nations have been constantly arguing of the need for public fiscal austerity, meaning they're cutting down on public budgets, they're doing less social spending, we're seeing poverty increase in these nations, and people who are really needing help are not getting it.
Let's speak to Jakob Musick, a host of Voice of Revolution Radio, joining us via Skype from Orlando. Many thanks for joining us here on PressTV. Now, first of all, your opinion as far as this report goes, where the UN has said that there is no evidence of Iran supplying weapons to the Ansarullah movement. This has been the entire pretext of this recent blockade, tightening of the blockade on Yemen, and even the war as a whole, as Saudi Arabia continues to blame Iran.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think Saudi Arabia is using this as a pretext. Honestly, I don't really think this was ever really about the missile. We're talking about one missile. Look at the entire barrage of armaments that have come down on Yemen for the past 2 years. I mean, the situation in Yemen is the shame of the world. The country that is the poorest in the region is about to undergo the biggest famine that perhaps we've ever seen in our times. Already the UN has said the cholera has spread to the greatest extremes since they began to record such things. And this is due to the blockade in all aspects of airports and seaports and land routes that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is committing upon Yemen. It's using this Iran intervention alleged and this one missile as an excuse to continue to punish the country. But it's been doing these things since way before this one missile even launched. I mean, we have aid that is just across the Gulf of Aden in Eritrea and Djibouti that is waiting to be delivered, that cannot be delivered because the coalition led by the Saudis is blocking it. And we see Saudi Arabia is especially virulent this year. Right now, despite some sort of nobility shakeup that they are undergoing, they're causing chaos in Lebanon. We have no idea what's going on with the leadership of Lebanon, allegedly, perhaps maybe under house arrest. Their criminal ties to other groups such as Daesh, their historical relation with the Taliban. For them to have the hypocrisy to say that if it were true that the Islamic Republic was funding the Houthis, that this is inappropriate, that this is wrong. Say that is true. Let's look at the groups that Saudi Arabia is funding. The cause of the Houthis is so much more just than these other bloodthirsty groups like Daesh and al-Nusra Front. And so Saudi Arabia is using this completely as a pretext. It's inappropriate. The situation in Yemen is the shame of the world, and every warm-blooded person needs to react to this, because what Saudi Arabia and its allies are committing in this region is nothing short of criminal.
Right now, by blaming Iran, doesn't Saudi Arabia sort of achieve two goals in one, in the sense that it continues to adopt its hostile measures against Yemen under the pretext of trying to defend it against foreign meddling, and at the same time continue its belligerent policies against Iran? We've seen Saudi Arabia blame Iran for all the crises it has created within the region.
Absolutely. So we know that Saudi Arabia has not been with good relations with the Islamic Republic since at least 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. It's always been worried that there would be some sort of religious renewal among its own population, whether Shia or Sunni. And they've been rivals in the region because, to a certain extent, Iran has a legitimacy, an Islamic legitimacy, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as a hereditary monarchy does not. And so from the very beginning, for so many years, for 40 years, Saudi Arabia has been at odds with Iran. It doesn't, I mean, Yemen is just the latest theater of this ongoing proxy war between these two. And we know that, Saudi Arabia's ally is a satellite of the United States, has recently thrown its cooperation with the State of Israel into the open. So I think the sides are quite clearly drawn. And blaming Iran for the situation in Yemen, when it is Saudi Arabia that is blocking this vital humanitarian access into the country, is the latest in Saudi Arabia showing the world what it represents.
Joining us now via Skype from Orlando is Jakob Musick. He's a host of Voice of the Revolution Radio. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, sir. Now, what do you make of this admission by this former security advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu? It seems it's just a confirmation of what we've been witnessing in the past few years as far as the alignment of Saudi and Israeli interests in the region.
Absolutely, yeah. So for people in the know, this is not really a surprise. What is surprising is how open that the Saudi kingdom is now being about its intentions to establish diplomatic relations with the State of Israel. I mean, this is quite shocking. We are conditioned, and we have been conditioned, to pit the Arab states against the State of Israel, traditionally speaking. But these things are changing. And if you look at Saudi Arabia and the State of Israel, they actually have some quite deep-seated similarities. One is that both of them are based on or draw their elan from religious themes. Israel is based on the State of Israel, and its premise is the Old Testament of the Bible, where it is said that God gives that Holy Land to the Jews, while Saudi Arabia has much prestige from owning the territory of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Both of these countries are religious centers. That is a similarity between the two. And also, both of them have ties particularly in religious fundamentalism and religious radicalism. Another thing they both share is their close alliance with the United States, high amounts of weaponry purchase, and, like you have mentioned, their shared disdain for Iran. So while we may be initially surprised at this, when we think about it for a little bit longer, the two countries are almost becoming natural allies.
Right, now, where does that leave the Palestinian cause then?
Well, it leaves the Palestinian cause having to look for support from different forces, not necessarily from these traditional Arab or Gulf states that that Palestine has received support from. It is likely that the Gulf states will perhaps follow Saudi Arabia in seeking to establish relations and appease Israel, which would mean turning their backs on Palestine, at least to an extent. So I believe that while Palestine is, there are signs of more Palestinian unity between Fatah and Hamas, they will have to look towards Iran more, Syria and Hezbollah, for their support. if these Arab states, the Sunni Arab states, withdraw their commitment that they have historically made to the Palestinian people and to Palestinian statehood.
And then would it then be safe to say that certain Persian Gulf Arab states like Saudi Arabia are then abandoning the Palestinian cause?
I think it really remains to be seen. It would be very hard to conceive of it being possible to collaborating and being in an alliance with the State of Israel and also standing for the right of Palestinian statehood. I don't believe any country has successfully or coherently taken these positions before. I'm not sure if it's even possible to walk a line between them. So on the one hand, it remains to be seen, but it's so highly unlikely that they could continue to maintain and fight for the Palestinian cause. So in a sense, it could very easily be seen as Saudi and the associated states withdrawing their commitment from Palestine.
Okay, let's leave it there for now. That's Jakob Musick.
I absolutely agree with Iran's FM that there is no military solution to the quagmire that both the United States and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan find themselves in. After the September 11th attacks, the United States and NATO invades, dislodges Taliban, and sets up a government, the current government, headed by Karzai and his warlord clique. And they are backed by the foreign forces of NATO and US. 16 years later, they have about 57-ish% control of the country. The Taliban have about 38%, and Daesh is present in a little bit. But the situation is not good for the Afghan government. After 16 years of being patronized by the strongest country in the world, or one of the strongest countries in the world militarily, if you are keeping with the same strategy for 16 years and you still don't have control of the country, then clearly something needs to change. The president has had an enormously pompous and frankly completely unwarranted, arrogant attitude towards China, as if the United States and other countries don't need China. China is the factory, the workshop of the world. Israel knows that many European countries are becoming less and less tolerant of the apartheid situation in the West Bank and Gaza, and that they are no longer tolerating the colonial project, despite the fact that it was Europeans and Americans that initiated it. More than 100 years ago, initiated the project of Zionism. I don't think that Europe is in the same place that it was, where it wants to support such a venture.
All right, now joining me now live from Orlando is Jakob Musick, host of the Voice of the Revolution Radio. Thank you for joining us, sir. This morning, like I said, 10 women were killed in a wedding ceremony in Yemen, and then earlier in the day, 3 other people got killed in air raids. Friday, also, dozens of people got killed in Saudi air raids in different locations across Yemen. What do you think could be the reason for this recent escalation of situation?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say this was an escalation. Saudi Arabia's behavior in the country of Yemen has been imperialistic, has had disregard for human rights, and has been not obeying the laws of war. We know that Saudi Arabia and the United States have very close ties and relationships, and to be honest, the United States attacks civilians engaging in the same kinds of activities with drones in Afghanistan and has done for many years, as well as Pakistan. So these are time-tested techniques of trying to break a civilian population of a country. And for whatever reason, Saudi Arabia has seen Yemen as within its sphere of influence, and it wants to crush the indigenous resistance. And in its intervention, it seems that civilian life does not matter.
Right, and you mentioned the U.S. Drone attacks elsewhere, like in Afghanistan, taking people's lives.
Yes.
What do you think is the U.S. role in Saudi Arabia? Is it kind of complicit in the Saudi war in Yemen?
I would say 100%. The USA may not be a main belligerent in this conflict, but the USA is one of the drivers of the civil war in Yemen, because one of the three big exports of my country, the United States, is weapons. We do sell weapons to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and have army and military bases in Saudi Arabia. We know that American weapons are being used on the Saudi side against Yemeni and Houthi forces. I would not be surprised if these drone strikes were done in collaboration with U.S. forces, or that Saudi Arabia was having strategic advisory capabilities coming from the United States to them. So, I mean, this almost looks like a copy of what the United States does when they are trying to fight indigenous movements in countries hostile to them. And the Saudis seem to be trying to use these same techniques, disregarding whether people of Yemen are combatants or whether they are civilians. They seem to have declared war on the entire nation. And this is also evidenced by the fact that Saudi Arabia had blockaded aid and food supplies into the country, allowing famine and cholera to spread.
All right, thank you for your thought. Jakob Musick, host of Voice of the Revolution Radio. Thank you.
And I think what an important issue to look at with weapons sales in the United States is that weapons are one of the few exports that the United States still has. Corn is another one, and then weapons is a second, and the third is natural gas and shale oil. And so weapons and defense contracting is a very important part and a very lucrative part of the American economy. Weapons contractors are very much situated within the political elites and the establishment in the United States. They lobby very hard, and so I'm sure that they had a role to play in the decision to deploy arms to Ukraine and sell these arms. NATO is essentially a vessel of American foreign policy, just as the Warsaw Pact was a vessel for the Soviet Union. I think that the US has been, as well as NATO, has been quite patient with Petro Poroshenko. He has had since 2014 to establish the Western interests in Ukraine and to quell the rebellions that are in the east of the country. He has failed to do so. He has also failed to marshal the population to fight effectively a very unpopular war, a civil war against DPR and LPR. And these are wars that are very unpopular, especially in the Russian portions of the country. So while they may still be open to profiting from selling weapons to Ukraine, we may see a rollback in support in 2018, and it wouldn't be super surprising if the United States and NATO decided they would rather have a different actor controlling Ukraine that would better serve their interests. I think at this point, within the past year, Syria has regained much of its legal territory, and it is on the front foot. While Kurds have also found very much success. I mean, again, they do control about 1/3 of the country. That being said, I think it shows an imperial level of arrogance for the United States, which doesn't even border this country, has done nothing but sow chaos, does not have the interests of the people of Syria at heart, and actually wants to instigate regime change, which would bring chaos again to this country, which is only now starting to calm down and reconstruct.
Now joining me live from Orlando is the host of Voice of the Revolution Radio, Jakob Musick. Jakob, good to have you with us. President Rouhani and other Iran officials just emphasized, as I just mentioned, that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, has been considered a victory for Iran and a defeat for the U.S. And no matter how hard President Trump has tried, the deal has been robust enough not to be shattered. What do you make of it?
Yeah, honestly, I think the JCPOA, which is such a landmark agreement, it took around 10 years to fully craft, is a positive thing for everyone involved, both Iran and the United States. I think that it's not a defeat of the United States. There's a lot of propaganda here in the United States against this agreement, but I think that it's good for both sides. It's good for everyone involved, and hopefully once the Trump administration is over, the JCPOA
and the relations that it has established between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic, which maybe not existed before, could lay the groundwork for an understanding and hopefully a peace in the future.
Joining us out of Orlando, Florida now is Mr. Jakob Musick, host of Voice of Revolution Radio. Hello, Jacob. Thanks for joining us back on the program. Now, your thoughts on this deafening silence we're hearing out of Western nations with regard of the atrocities, the protracted atrocities we're hearing about every day taking place in Yemen, especially targeting the civilian population, women and children.
Yeah, it is very sad and it is quite a deafening silence, especially when we take into account the severity of the situation there. As we were talking about in the package beforehand, a majority of the people who are suffering from the cholera and the diphtheria outbreaks in this country are the children, teenagers, adolescents, and young adults. More than 70% of those who are infected with the diphtheria, which is preventable with a vaccine, are the young people, and it is a deafening silence. If you look, I just looked before this segment, there were only about 2 articles from major news sources about this, and one of them is Al Jazeera from Qatar, and the other, surprisingly enough, is Washington Post from the United States. But organizations like Save the Children and World Health Organization are saying that Saudi Arabia has said that it's opened the port in Hodeidah, but it actually hasn't. And there needs to be more supplies, and Saudi Arabia is still squelching the ability to provide life-saving health care to the people in Yemen.
So, I mean, the so-called champions or the beacon of democracy out of Washington, out of Westminster, I mean, the silence, and it's not only silence, is it? It's also complicity, because they're working with Riyadh in helping them, you know, secure the blockade there, giving them arms, the arms they're using to bomb the civilian infrastructure. So there's complicity here. Not only they're turning their back on the atrocities, they're complicit in what's taking place.
It absolutely is not only complicity, but giving a complete pass and almost authorizing the actions of the U.S.'s ally, Saudi Arabia, not only in Yemen, but also over the past few years, the persecution of the Shia community of Saudi that is in the northeastern quarter of that country. But I mean, we see this across the board with the United States and its allies. I mean, think about the State of Israel, one of the major committers of the world crime of apartheid in the Holy Land. I mean, the United States doesn't necessarily hold its allies to the highest of moral standards, and it doesn't even ask the allies that it has to share what it likes to call American values, whether those are democratic or human rights values. So unfortunately, this is not surprising, but it's very tragic.
And when all this, Jacob, is drowned out in bureaucracy and politics, so where's the recourse for the women and children in Yemen? How can they put an end to this thing? How do you solve this crisis right now?
Well, of course, it has to be solved with the recognition of the indigenous forces, the Houthis and their allies. They occupy Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen. They are a strong force. They have made gains against the Saudis. They've made gains against the Houthi forces. And Saudi Arabia, you know, like we've seen, it's been making these power moves with new leadership, trying to put states in the region, create satellite states. And Yemen is not going along with that. Yemen is and so the recourse is the continued struggle and bravery and defiance and the humanity and the power that we see in the suffering people of Yemen, that despite the hardships, they continue to face their invaders, and hopefully they will be able to drive out the foreigners and return indigenous control to the Aden region as well.
Thank you for joining us there out of Orlando, Florida, Mr. Jakob Musick, host of Voice of Revolution Radio.
Joining us live now from Florida is Jakob Musick, who is the host of Voice of the Revolution Radio. Jacob, thanks very much for joining us here on Press TV. What do you make of the Saudi connection to terrorism, not of course only in plots that Iran may have uncovered, but throughout the region?
Yeah, so this is very early news. We don't know a whole lot about this. From what the Iranian security agencies are saying, that they say that there is a state actor behind it, and it is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Although, you know, they haven't released too many details about what groups they used, what proxies they used, and we don't have a whole lot of information. What we can deduce right now is that, you know,
it would be very believable that Saudi Arabia would be behind such a thing. They were one of the prime sponsors of what could be called terrorist groups in the 20th century and continuing into the 21st century, specifically with their exportation of Takfiri Islam, the Wahhabi school of Sunni Islam, which was very influential in regime change in Afghanistan, as well as the attempted regime change in Syria.
I wonder then, Jacob, to what benefit of Saudi Arabia is it to carry out terror attacks in a country like Iran?
Well, they've actually stated, and this is why it makes me kind of wonder why they would do something so obvious. We've actually seen Saudi officials recently come out and state that it's frustrated. Its political elite and the clerical elite there, which want to see the spread of Sunni Islam, of specifically Wahhabi Sunni Islam, they have made even statements where they're saying they want to bring the conflict to Iran. They want to bring the battlefield and the front to Iran. So that's why they couldn't, I mean, if this really was Saudi Arabia, they couldn't really be more obvious about this.